All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the MLS Hour. We have a great panel for you today. For this webinar, we're going to preview the MLS policy recommendations that will be going to the MLS Committee as part of our 2020 annual conference here at NAR. I'm joined by Rodney Gansho and Charlie Lee on NAR staff, and we have Greg Zadell and Chris Carrillo who have a ton of information to share today. So to get us started, I'm going to turn this over to Rodney Gansho. We'll get started by talking first about the MLS Standards Workgroup recommendations. If Rodney, if you can give us just some brief background on how that group came to be, and then maybe we can turn over to Greg and Chris to give us some more expanded information on the discussions and the policies that came out of that group.
Thanks a lot, Rene. So yeah, whenever we get recommendations like this, the first question is, where does this come from? And you've probably heard the mention of the MLS Standards Work Group. That's a group that was impaneled late last year. And the purpose of that group was to explore the idea of standards for multiple listing services. For those of you who have been around the Realtor organization for a number of years, you know we have core standards for associations of Realtors, and they have different categories and they've set the bar for what an association of Realtors should be providing as far as a level of service to its members. Right after that, the conversation started circling around, well, we should do MLS. And I can tell you that it wasn't immediately received and the positive reception to doing such a thing, that there was a lot of stuff going on as far as the implementation of core standards and all of that. Through the years, as the MLS Advisory Board had dealt with different issues, the idea of standards would creep back into the conversation and often be pushed to the side as well. Yeah, but let's get back to what we're talking about. Late last year, that same thing happened again. And it was the recommendation of the advisory board to form the standards work group. The group itself, like I said, appointed the end of last year. Plans were to meet in person in spring and move forward with recommendations and their due diligence in the area. That was all put on hold because of the pandemic, and we quickly moved to a remote schedule, a robust remote schedule that had that group meeting very frequently for many, many hours. Because when you talk about standards, it's easy to say something like that. When you really start having those conversations to figure out what it is you want to address and approach, it's a challenging thing. And I'm sure that Chris in his comments will likely speak to that and how we got to where we are. But so the advisory or the work group did its due diligence, realized that it should break up its work into two phases. The first phase being the 8 recommendations that are coming before the committee in November. And they see this as a stepping stone, as support for the work of the work group as it continues into next year, where they hope to bring forward a final list of MLS standards and a process with regard to adoption and implementation of those for consideration at the May meetings. So those recommendations went to the advisory board. The advisory board supported those recommendations, made some changes to the wording. Staff then took that, worked with the different content experts within NAR from our legal affairs department, our professional standards area, our fair housing area, to craft the specific policy language and to fine tune the recommendations to make sure that we were saying what we needed to say and we were bringing forth the best possible recommendations and policies that we could. And that's what you all have in front of you in the 8 recommendations that are part of the committee's agenda.
Thank you for that, Rodney. Greg, Chris, if you can give us a perspective. So Chris, for those that may not know, is CEO of Metro MLS in Milwaukee. He was co-chair of the standards work group and had a lot of great input from the MLS perspective. And Greg Zadell, broker and member of the work group as well. And so you each bring different perspectives and an approach to standards, but can you give us some insight into the discussions and what led up to the policies? And we'll get the policy recommendations, and we'll get into each of those here shortly. Greg?
So just to give a little bit of a background, a lot of this came about, as Rodney said, over the years, because what the advisory board and the MLS committee have been working on are ways, typically we get requests from brokerage firms or from franchises or groups of brokers that are dealing in multiple MLSs and dealing with differences in those MLSs, and there's not the consistency. And so that's really where the genesis of the idea of, well, if we had some things that are minimum standards that could be consistent across all of the different MLSs, that makes it a much more efficient process for the brokerage community to handle. And so it wasn't coming from the MLSs, but then as MLSs discuss this, then they're seeing, hey, there's some validity in this. So when we're working with our neighbors, when we're working with our customers, our participants, we're serving them the best that we can. And so we worked real hard when we appointed this group to get a good diversity. We've got about half the group is from the brokerage community of sizes from me to people with thousands of agents. And we have MLSs from small, board MLS combos all the way up to really large regionals and a variety of folks. And so it's critical with the committee the work group, as well as the MLS advisory board. We've got this huge diversity, and therefore we can bring a lot of different opinions and different backgrounds into the mix, and it's amazing the different conversations you have. So Chris was one of the people herding these cats, and he can kind of give you some more background on how that happened.
So thank you, Greg. And anybody that's been in the industry on the policy side, the amount of passion and work that Greg puts into it, and he's done the same thing through this process. So they asked John Coyle and myself to co-chair the group and go through this process. And I consider myself very lucky to be part of this process with a really solid group of people trying to get our arms around this new concept of what should be included with MLS standards. And anybody that knows anything about John Coyle, that he's a proponent for how brokers must be able to utilize the MLS as a tool and the content they provide to power the businesses of what they want to do today, but going forward. So that John is going to push the envelope to say, we need more from the MLSs. For myself, and I'll be clear that the group has said this from the very beginning, this has never been about the quantity of MLSs or the number of MLSs that are operating within the country at any given time. This is about quality of services that translates back to brokers and participants and agents from MLSs. So this has everything to do with quality. So going back to the beginning, we talked about it this morning. Yes, there's been a lot of work behind it. I think anybody can understand that. Art Carter, I think, said on an earlier call that in his tenure of being in the industry, he's never devoted so much time to a work group. And I think that says something because Art's been around and been involved in many different respects. So yes, the 8 recommendations has actually come from countless of hours of Rodney and Rene and Greg, myself, and many others getting on these calls trying to think what is the best way to represent recommendations that are meaningful to what the product of MLS is. And so these 8 recommendations, some of them we would call low-hanging fruit. Some of them are a little bit more thought-provoking. And if you go back, we had to get to this baseline of the philosophical approach to MLS. What is our role today and what should it be going forward? How do we best utilize our services to ensure that the product is meaningful to the brokerage experience and the consumers that they're trying to engage? Katie Johnson came and I think motivated us with an exercise, not to go into the detail, but a brew exercise saying, maybe we should approach this saying organized real estate doesn't exist. How do we facilitate transactions and how does the MLS fit organically in that process? That was a lot of work, but it was helpful. And I think even for those of us on this call who participated, people who have been there and done that and have been in this process, you realized that there are a lot of stakeholders involved, because that was our purpose, to go and identify the stakeholders so that we knew when it was said and done that the recommendations that we focused on bringing relevancy to the stakeholders involved in that process. And so that's how we got to where we started, to where these 8 recommendations came. And I'm excited to talk more about that. But I'll also say that I've always been more of the libertarian approach, saying NAR should allow MLSs to innovate and compete with one another in an organic way. And I think that these recommendations help elevate the bar of MLS while still maintaining that MLSs can still be unique and innovate and serve their markets to the best extent that they can.
Great, thank you for that. So let's dive into each of the recommendations, and there's a number of them. So we'll try to work through them as best as possible and get some thoughts on maybe how they elevate the MLSs, what pain points they're addressing for MLSs and members alike. Rodney, can you walk us through the recommendations here? If we can start with recommendation 1, maybe just high level telling us what that one is, and Greg and Chris, if you can give us your thoughts on those as we go.
So this is the appendices that you'll find in the committee agenda. Recommendation 1, that the following guidance for administrative sanctions be added to the MLS disciplinary guidelines outlined in the MLS handbook at part 2F, enforcement of rules, section 5. So the direction of this is to provide MLS's guidance, and include that in the handbook on multiple listing policy as it relates to issuing discipline, specifically administrative discipline. So you'll see that the provision, oops, sorry guys, I'm getting a call, that the added language creates a few categories and then provides some guidance, some structure to what the violations for those different categories for either an initial violation or a repeat violation might look like. This is similar to direction and guidance that we have in the professional standards side when issuing discipline for violations of the code, but this would be something specific in the handbook and specific to multiple listing services. There's also an added piece that is more or less a worksheet, a schedule for different actions and the violation of the rule that it relates to, and an opportunity for an MLS to include what the discipline would be as far as a fine or training or something like that, so that you have it, it's considered prior to the violation, and the MLS can consistently apply that discipline for that particular action. So the whole thought behind recommendation 1 is guidance, direction. It's not a requirement. It's an informational section, as you'll see at the end where it says informational. Where does it say informational? Right there, the I at the bottom. But this will hopefully create consistency among MLSs as far as their application of the rules and their issuing of sanctions. And I'll stop there, Rene, for this one. Do you want to go through all of them, or you want to go one by one?
Let's start off with this one. Just if we can address the kind of the overarching idea behind this, and the need to provide some guidance to MLSs on rules enforcement and administering disciplinary actions or sanctions. Rodney, what's the thinking behind that? I know we provide some direction, if you will, in the policy handbook, and in that the rules are intended to be enforced where appropriate. Punishment has to fit the crime, if you will. But what pain point was this solving, Greg and Chris, and how will this help to advance and elevate MLSs?
Well, I guess, first of all, it's that consistency across markets again. So brokerage dealing in one MLS is going to have it doesn't mean it's going to be the exact same rules enforcement or punishment list in another MLS, but it's going to be similar, so that they're not dealing with one area where it might just be thought of as a cost of doing business and not pay attention to status changes or whatever it might be. And the same thing with any of the policies like clear cooperation or whatever they are. The desire is to have that consistency and that data integrity across the board. The MLS creates this marketplace for all us to use to be able to help our buyers and sellers find houses and get them into homes. And without that integrity in that database and that system, we're not able to do as good a job for the public. So it's critical that we have that across the country.
Chris?
Yeah, I think just to add what Greg said, this comes from the philosophical approach that if you buy into the fact that MLSs exist to provide an accurate, reliable data set, how do we get there? We can say it, but how do you do it? This concept may be new to MLSs who perhaps haven't taken a proactive stance in the past to ensure that the compilation is accurate. In that process, how do you categorize infractions, right? And I believe the conversation we got into is not all errors are equal within the MLS. Clearly, if there's somebody who's violating clear cooperation, well, that's different. You're now getting to the fundamental violation of interfering with cooperation, which could have many other repercussions. So I very much like the recommendation by categorizing the kinds of infractions. Category 1 goes right into incorrect zip code or something else that actually could have bigger issues downstream someplace. But it puts these categories in place so that if you're an MLS and you say, this is great, how do I approach infractions? This helps organize what those are and examples thereof. So this is a really good starting place, and also I think highlights the fact that not two mistakes may not be equal.
Great, thank you for that. And again, if you have any questions now or throughout the rest of the webinar here, feel free to send over your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll get those addressed as we go along here. Rodney, for recommendation 2 and 3, we'll kind of lump those together. Again, if you can introduce those, and then we can talk about the rationale behind those.
Yeah, glad to. So recommendation 2, you see on the screen, I'm not going to read this for you guys, but in essence, what it's saying is that for your participants and subscribers who receive 3 administrative sanctions within a calendar year, that they'll in essence lose their ability to pay an administrative sanction at that point. They would have to attend a hearing to consider their actions. And that there's an exception to that, and that's where the MLS may want to allow a greater number of administrative sanctions for violations that are about listing information provided by the participant or the subscriber, or what we saw in recommendation number 1 is that category 1. And recommendation number 3 is more accountability on behalf of the brokers. That if brokers have, first of all, they should be informed and provided information about all the administrative sanctions that their subscribers are receiving. And that once the subscriber reaches that maximum level and has to attend a hearing, that the participant has to attend that hearing with the subscriber as well, to make sure that they have oversight and they understand what that subscriber is doing, and make sure that they're involved in that type of guidance and direction the licensee and subscriber should be getting. The thinking behind this one was in some markets with some licensees, some brokers, maybe even, that it's a cost of doing business approach to certain violations of the rules, and that the work group wanted to see greater importance placed on abiding by the rules for all the reasons Chris brought up, that it's about data integrity, it's about creating the best data set that the MLS can, and the best way to do that is having your participants and your subscribers following the rules. And that sums up those 2. And you see from this that it also includes a change in the policy language under section 7.21. And somebody had asked about a link to this. This you can find on nar.realtor under the committee agenda. And I'll see if while other people are talking here, if I can't find that URL and put it in the comments section for everybody.
Great, thank you. And so for the first recommendation, that one is informational guidance, not a mandatory. 2 and 3 would be mandatory.
2 and 3 are mandatory. It doesn't mean that the MLS can't have their own process with regard to certain sanction structure, but they would at a minimum have to follow this where it indicates that 3 administrative sanctions that you no longer have an opportunity to do that. You have to attend a hearing with the exception.
Got it. Greg, from the broker perspective, how does this impact brokers who are not only running their day-to-day business, but also are responsible for oversight of their licensees? There's been some questions about how this plays out in the day-to-day management. Does this add additional burdens for the broker? Does this help the broker with what's already required of them, typically by state license requirements, or just general supervision of the licensees?
So I think it first of all makes the brokers aware of things that they might not be aware of. And brokers want to be aware of what's going on, what they're responsible for. So I think that helps. It really helps the rest of the brokers that are doing it right, because this puts more pressure on those that are breaking the rules to come up and meet the criteria and take a responsibility in it. And it doesn't matter what kind of brokerage model you have, you're still, as a participant, responsible for your subscribers, or as a broker responsible for your associates in your office. So I think it helps on both ends, where they're going to know a little bit more what's going on under them, but then also their transactions that they're working with other people on are going to be it's going to raise the bar. And the other good thing about this, especially when we're talking about multiple MLSs, is their consistency. Because one of the big things for brokerages is gaining associates, or the competition for broker associates. And if one brokerage is subjected to a high standard and another brokerage is subjected to a lower standard, that could give one a competitive advantage for agents to come to them, because, hey, we're going to look the other way on these things versus not. So it actually makes competition better, because they're both dealing with the same minimum standards.
Thank you. Chris, from the MLS administrator side, is this above and beyond what MLSs are generally doing today, or why the need to specify these specific actions for MLS administrators?
I think number one, it ensures that MLSs are using a best practice of a tier of escalation to get around what I think Rodney talked about. 99% of our realtor members are professional. They want to follow the rules. There's this occasional one that looks at violating MLS rules as the cost of doing business, and I want to get away with it, right? So what this does is this allows a structure by which the member can be held accountable. And why is that? Because the responsibility of the MLS is to provide this compilation back to the body of realtors to be able to do their job, right? So it ensures due process, but it also ensures a tier of escalation, and again, a model that MLSs can follow. And before we get any responses from any of my friends and colleagues, I will draw attention to the bottom of recommendation number 2. The one thing that I draw attention to my staff at Metro MLS, which my manager of data integrity is on this, Dina. We are not creating traffic courts, and I don't think that's the intent here on this call or in this policy. It says that except that MLS may allow more administrative sanctions for violations of listing information provided by participants and subscribers before requiring a hearing. If anybody's ever worked at the DMV, I apologize. I'm not trying to offend you. As I tell my staff, the MLS is not a DMV. We're not a bureaucracy that simply says, I'm sorry, but in my policy it says to do X. No, it's a member-centric approach, and we are not going to create a bureaucratic process. So if you're on this call and you say, geez, Joe Smith down the street entered their third listing with an incorrect street suffix. No, as an MLS, this is not saying that you have to go before a hearing for that, right? This is about applying some common sense to how you want to structure the process going forward. But inevitably, the participant is responsible. And there is a time that if an agent continues to do certain things over and over again, that as an MLS, you may have to get the participant involved. Because again, who's the member of the MLS? The participant is.
Great, thank you for that, Chris. Rodney, there was a question that came in about when these policies would go into effect. Can you just clarify that before we move on to recommendation 4?
So unless indicated otherwise by the committee in what is approved by the board of directors or by the board of directors or executive committee, all recommendations that are approved, MLS policy recommendations, those would go into effect January of the following year. So we would be looking at January 1, 2021. And MLSs would have 60 days to implement those changes. So then we'd be looking at MLSs having to adopt these policy changes and incorporate them into their practices by March 1 of 2021.
Great, thank you for that. So the next recommendation gets into processing complaints that the MLS receives. So someone's violated an MLS rule that's being reported, and that reporting party would like to remain anonymous. Rodney, can you walk us through that one briefly, and then we can have a discussion behind that?
So recommendation number 4 is just that. And a lot of MLSs, and through the discussion at the work group, it was discovered that a lot of MLSs already provide for this. So we should solidify it in policy and encourage other MLSs to adopt the same thing. And that is to include an ability for somebody to bring forth a complaint of another participant without having to identify their name. In other words, an anonymous complaint. That there's a certain stigma attached to bringing forth a complaint, especially in smaller markets where everybody's going to know everybody else. So that if you're able to bring that forward, again, you're going to have cleaner information. You're going to have more accountability under the rules. You're going to have cleaner information, which benefits all of the industry stakeholders. So if a complaint, though, rises to the level of going to a hearing, because we all know that if somebody is issued an administrative sanction, policy indicates that they can refute that and say, no, I want to have a hearing. So if they have a hearing as part of due process, one of the elements is that you have to be able to face your accuser. So if that complainant is unwilling to participate or disclose their name as part of that complaint, that the MLS could have either the MLS representative from the MLS committee or the grievance committee, MLS staff, or another representative act in the role as the complainant during the hearing of that particular action.
Chris, I'm going to start with you on this one. One of the on the flip side of that, one of the concerns that is often brought up is whether or not this will enable or allow for an increase in frivolous complaints, where there's a complaint filed, and because there's anonymity that's guaranteed, that something will be enforced as to a listing broker on a particular issue. But what's the enforcement process today, even without this rule, look like? Do MLSs conduct or confirm that a violation has occurred? Is there some sort of investigation that happens? And even beyond that, right? Once you turn that over to the association, if there's a hearing, is there a mechanism in place to ensure that complaints aren't just being frivolously filed and kicked out if there's no violation that's present?
Absolutely. First of all, the unanimous approach is, or anonymous is the approach that we currently have right now. MLSs, many MLSs imply or employ software that goes through and screens for business rules. And that's only one way to do it. Once business rules kick back potential violations, it requires discretion, i.e. human eyeballs, to go and review every single instance to see if in fact there's a violation. Sometimes that's data driven. In cases where it's not, you can't create software compliance to do that. It requires sometimes practitioners who use the MLS in a way that an MLS administrator never would. And so that's why we rely on realtors to really encourage them to call in to say, I'm unsure about this one, can you look into it? In every single instance, though, it works because we have a human taking the feedback and actually following through to see if, in fact, I call it smoke and fire. Sometimes there's smoke, but there's not fire. It allows us the opportunity to ensure that there is no violation or that there are no MLS policies being violated in that case. So it requires both. In every instance, though, it does require a human eyeball to go and actually, with discretion, to take a look at something in black and white and say, did something happen here or not? And that's the beautiful thing about MLS as opposed to, say, professional standards. Professional standards, there's a hearing, there's evidence, there's many other factors that go into it. The majority of the issues that come through MLS, it's really data driven, right? It doesn't really require a judgment to say, if you put the wrong school district in, for example, is that something that you want a hearing about? No, you put the wrong school district in, let's correct it and move on.
Great, thank you. And that does seem to be kind of the rationale for enforcement at a lot of MLSs, right? If it's one of those black and white data-driven violations that yay or nay, that's something that typically will be handled by staff. But if there's something where more closer to two sides weighing of evidence, arguments that need to be presented and discussions that need to be fleshed out, that typically is something that gets referred over to the hearing process. Greg, has that been your experience on the broker side? And to go with that, knowing that this recommendation could be adopted, what are some of the things that brokers can be doing to work with their agents and licensees to ensure that true and accurate data is being reported in?
Well, it's almost like voting. If you don't vote, don't complain. If you see problems in the data, turn it in. If you're seeing properties that you're sending off to a buyer and they're not accurate, don't just complain about it. Send it in. You get it corrected. And people, there was also a comment on there I saw about what if it's a secretary or an administrative staff or whomever that puts these things in incorrectly. All the time as a broker, we're responsible for our broker associates. And if they do something wrong, or a staff person that you hire does something wrong, that's still, the buck stops here. And so it means, hey, we got to train this person better. Maybe the agent didn't fill out the form correctly. It's a learning opportunity, and most people, for the vast majority of people, aren't going to do these things on purpose. It's things that are accidental. It's, hey, I slipped up. But if they're listing a buy level as a ranch so that it gets shown, they need to be called out.
Rene, I think I'll jump on that question that was in the chat, if that's okay. Somebody asked about what's the difference between an administrative sanction and a violation. Administrative sanctions are an opportunity for the MLS, without going into a due process hearing and all the due diligence and the merits of somebody's actions, to look at the actions of an MLS participant or a subscriber and to make a determination either through staff or through a committee as to whether or not that those actions violated the rules. And they can issue a fine or training. And if you're using that schedule of fines from recommendation 1, you'll already know what that is. And you would inform the recipient of that if you pay this or you do this training, that's the end of it. The recipient of that has an opportunity to refute it and say, well, no, I don't believe I violated that, or they don't agree with the sanction that's issued, and request that it get to that next level, which is a hearing. So an administrative sanction is a less cumbersome process. If you're familiar with the professional standard side, it's the citation process that they have. So rather than going through all of the machinations of important machinations of the professional standards process, you are able to just pay off or attend training to resolve a violation of the rules. They're still seen as a violation. It's just a different process.
Great, thank you for that, Rodney. You don't need to display this one. I think it's pretty straightforward, Rodney, but I'm gonna jump, just because the discussion took us there. Before we get to recommendation 5, I'm gonna jump ahead to recommendation 6, which ties into this discussion we just had about data. Recommendation 6 just says that participants and subscribers are required to submit accurate listing data and be required to correct any known errors. As the multiple listing service, the efficiencies and transparencies that it creates for not just for participants and subscribers, but more importantly for consumers, accurate data is certainly one of those top of mind and almost foundational concepts, right? Charlie, I want to come to you first on the impact that accurate data has, not just on participants, but more importantly on consumers. What are some of the considerations that members should have and MLSs should be working through to address accurate listing information that's being presented to consumers? There's a little bit of crossover into code of ethics, true picture, and other practice issues, right?
Definitely. Thanks, Rene. Yeah, I think one, there's just a legal requirement, just truth in advertisement and making sure that you don't mislead or present any representations that could be considered false. And that's just, the concern that state real estate commissions and governing bodies have, in that, if there's something that is going to mislead consumers in terms of what they're led to believe is maybe the property that is available or and how the property is being promoted, that's something that could result in, the government coming after your license or, disciplining you. And then on top of that, there's also concerns in terms of a lawsuit. I think on top of that, just from the consumer's perspective, it's about trust and reliability on both ends. The seller is looking to the broker to be able to promote their property in a way that is going to be legally compliant and also to be compliant and consistent with the policies. And I think that's a great thing about these policies and recommendations, is that it's really about looking to enhance the quality of the MLS, ensuring that brokers are able to fulfill their fiduciary duties. And then on top of that, I think it ensures that there is just trust, reliance, and integrity of the MLS. And that becomes compromised when there is data out there that may be misleading or not the most accurate. And then that belies, I think, what consumers look for when they're engaging a broker or agent, and then how their property is marketed in the MLS.
Great, thank you.
If you want, Renee, I can jump on a couple of the questions that we have in the chat.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So there was a question about offices and brokerages from Bob Bemis not offices from Bob Bemis, but question from Bob Bemis about offices that may have administrative staff, not the licensees, the agents, or the brokers inputting information. And well, how do you handle that if there's an inaccuracy or a violation of the rules for the information that's provided? The licensees and the agents and the brokers who those administrative staff work for, they're still responsible for the actions of those individuals. So they can't hide behind, it wasn't me, it was somebody else who did it. So they can still be found in violation of any data entry. And I would suspect that most MLS administration looks at it the same way. So those brokers, those licensees, they can be held accountable, and they should take an active role in making sure that the people who are entering the information are doing what they're doing, because they can be sanctioned for them not doing so. And then the other problem, but Laura brought up was about MLS's following NAR's rules to begin with, and that's causing more issues. I can tell you that following the rules and the whole recommendations that you see before you related to compliance, that's part of the discussion of the work group. And there is a concern of not just having the direction and the guidance and the resources that MLSs need to be consistent in applying the rules through different services, but to ensure that they are following mandatory policies. So you may see in phase 2 of this more direction and specific recommendation or criteria that speak to an MLS's obligation to enforce and implement more mandatory policies. We have that now from a standpoint of you have to adopt and implement mandatory policies, and you potentially lose insurance coverage. We may see come out of this group, and honestly, I don't think the group just doesn't know where they're going right now. They'd love to get direction and guidance from people, but you'll see something more in regard to that moving forward as criteria for an MLS standard At least that's what I suspect. And Chris is shaking his head, right? So he's the co-chair, so we know it to be true.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you for that, Rodney. And you bring up a great point, Rodney, which is if the work of the standards work group continues, they have their eyes set on phase 2. For those of you in attendance, if you have an idea of or have identified some pain points or have some thoughts on what phase 2 should look like, some recommendations, feel free to join the discussion in the hub. Send myself and Rodney an email. We'll get that to the standards work group. We welcome any and all feedback and suggestions as well. This is, truly is, I've said it before, right? It truly is policy by members for members. So we need to hear from you to address those pain points that are of a national perspective. Rodney, we have about 15 minutes left here in the hour. So let's get through the rest, through the remaining 3 recommendations, and then we have one more policy recommendation related to requiring an address on a listing. So recommendation number 5 relates to Web API. Can you tell us about that, Rodney?
So recommendation 5, Web API. Obviously, RESO has been an initiative of NAR and the industry for some point. As far as policy, we've required data dictionary adoption, providing information through Web API. There is a concern that has cropped up in different markets and brought to the attention of the work group that there is a disparity and perhaps a disincentive that's created because of it in data feeds from MLSs, that in some markets, the local MLS will provide a rich data feed with hundreds of data fields provided through RETS or some other platform, but for the Web API data feed, that it is substantially less. To try and resolve that issue, the advisory board is coming, not the work group and with the advisory board support, is coming forward with a recommendation that any data feed provided by the MLS, that the number of data fields, both for any other data feed and Web API, would need to be the same, or no less than the same number of data fields.
Great, thank you. Greg, this is one of those that's, sounds very technical and deals with, APIs and data dictionary and the things that work behind the scenes to operate things like IDX websites and other technology platforms. What's the impact on brokers and members and them being able to pull and access standardized data using Web API to plug into whether it's IDX websites, a chatbot, or any other technology that they might be employing?
Well, it's a more efficient way of doing it, because if a broker is, again, most of the larger brokerages and even some of us small ones deal with more than one MLS. And so you want to have that consistency across there. Or the vendors, that if I choose to use a program that a vendor needs to access, then they can get that efficiently through an API instead of having to try to rewrite systems differently for each. It's kind of the whole concept behind RETS in the first place, was to standardize things so that the marketplace can be much more efficient for the products they produce.
Great. Chris, is this something that you see more and more adoption in terms of members adopting, right? The use and taking advantage of being able to receive standardized data, both on the data dictionary and the Web API, and how do you see that playing out in your marketplace through your MLS?
So let me categorize this in 2 buckets, right? Everything, well, most of what we've talked about, it deals with data in and data out. And this component is really about getting data out. And it's all about ensuring not just reliability from the data set, but once you can ensure reliability on the data set, how do we efficiently and securely then transport that data in a meaningful way that consumers can utilize that in a modern fashion? Folks, RETS is not the way forward. It is the way to the past. API will drive us to the future, period, because that's how software is written nowadays, is through API. And so there's a myriad of benefits that come with it. I would say this: most of your vendors can do this right now. For those that would need some ramp up time, I've spoken to most of them, and this is okay. This is something that as an industry we can do. Remember, there was once an MLS world where we relied solely on FTP. FTP means that your vendor could get an update once a day. We all, when we transitioned from FTP to RETS, not to go on a history lesson, but that was fantastic. We can now get updates every 15 minutes. API allows that efficiently to happen real time. This is all about how information and technology evolves and advances. And as organized real estate, we need to participate in that. I think this is our way to say, look, starting next year, I don't want to use the word parity because anybody that gets into the minutia of how data moves, we know that most vendors are going to use the 1.7 data dictionary. Some of those data elements within the dictionary may not exactly match up with a local data element within a market that exists in RETS that could translate out to the web API. The majority of the content, though, will be able to get mapped out and to be able to utilize in the web API structure going forward. So don't get hung up on perhaps a DDIT doc to element, data element, not being able to translate the web API. The majority of this content is going to be there. And I think, as Rodney talked about, what we want to do is to say, generally speaking, if you're an MLS provider and your RETS IDX standard payload has 650 fields, we want to get as close as possible, if not 650, within that within the web API to create as close to parity as possible. We have to do it.
Great, thank you. Rodney, I'll just read the next recommendation, recommendation 7. That one's pretty straightforward, right? So recommendation 7 requires that MLSs display customer service and technical support contact information on their MLS website. What was the genesis of this? And Chris, I'll start with you. It seems something basic and simple to do, right? Why wasn't this already happening, and what pain point is this solving?
Well, if you're somebody that pays MLS fees, the thought is, not to boil it down too simply, if you have a question on the services that you receive, or you have a question on something to do with a data license, for example, who do I speak to? Who do I speak to? Is there, many MLSs have a built-in widget that you can go in and ask questions to on the fly. But at bare minimum, you should be able to pick up a phone or send an email to get your question answered. And I think it's just that basic.
Greg, on the member side, is this something that wasn't already happening? And it seems that, as a member, right, as a broker agent, you sign up for MLS access and service, you should be able to reach out to someone at the MLS and get help. But I think this also addresses even the before you get their stage, right? If you are interested in joining, if you have a technical issue or your vendor has a technical issue, they need to be able to reach someone at the MLS, right?
Yeah, it's, as Chris mentioned, just pretty basic communications, being able to do that.
And I think I'd point out too, it's not just the brokers and the licensees, it's outside vendors who may want to contact the MLS to inquire about data feeds on behalf of their participants or licensees, that you have to have ready access to information on who to contact.
Perfect, thank you. The final recommendation is dealing with fair housing. So recommendation 8 says that requires that MLSs implement a process for identifying potential violations of fair housing laws and working with participants and subscribers to rectify such potential violations. Rodney, scrolling down to that. Charlie, can you give us some thoughts on recommendation 8? And certainly it's one of those areas that we are discussing quite a bit in our industry, working towards finding solutions that advance and promote fair housing. It's part of the Realtor DNA, right? Ensuring fair housing and access. Can you give us some thoughts on recommendation 8?
Yeah, I mean, I think this just ties into, accurate data, but then also allowing the MLSs to address those issues that could arise where there are potential fair housing violations, and a system that can resolve them. So when, there is a problematic, maybe data entry, where someone thinks that there is a fair housing concern, The MLS then can allow for that to be reported to the participants and subscribers to be able to resolve them, so that if there is an issue, it can be corrected right away. As we know that, fair housing is an important matter, and I think it just really goes to reinforcing that and protecting consumers and also protecting brokers, because it could be a matter of maybe it's just a simple error, or it wasn't intended to be the way that it's being construed. And so then there is an opportunity for that discussion to occur and to maybe solve it by changing, certain words or the description. So I think that's, really the crux of it.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. And Rodney, I'll come back to you in a second if you can help us tee up the final recommendation for the address question. Greg, Chris, anything to add on recommendation 8?
Yeah, just briefly, I think in addition to just doing the right thing to promote fair housing through the MLS, which there's ample opportunity to do through providing accuracy, like Charlie said, but also I think we have a role to play in mitigating risk. If there's a fair housing violation and that information is fed via IDX or through any other way, if you're a broker displaying a fair housing violation on your website from a listing that you didn't even enter, the MLS should facilitate a way to mitigate that risk. And so it's just good protection for the participant and the subscribers that we serve.
Thank you for that. There's a couple questions that came in, and I keep referencing the hub, and Ashley was kind enough to link to the MLS open community within the hub. Certainly would invite you all to join that, continue the discussion in the hub. If you have additional questions, there may be some questions that we don't get an opportunity to address here. Please make a comment, post, and then we'll respond there. Members of the work group are also have access to that hub community, so we can continue to discuss those items surrounding the recommendations. We have one final one that we want to get to before we wrap up. That's also going to the MLS committee next month. It's next week already. Well, 2 weeks from in 2 weeks, a week and a half. Having a sense with grasping time these days. Rodney, can you display the final recommendation that's going to the committee, which is dealing with requiring an address to be shared on all listings filed with the service, on residential listings filed with the service? Can you walk us through that one?
Well, I'll point out that you're correct. It is next month, Rene. We're still October.
I got that right.
So you're safe, brother. You're safe. So this was an issue that came about outside of the normal meeting schedule. It pertained to the creation of private listing statuses or property types where an address of a listing would not be filed with the MLS, or if filed with the MLS would not be distributed to other participants and subscribers, that there was an added step to obtain the address. The added step being contacting the listing broker directly. In contacting the listing broker directly, there may be additional conditions like signing an NDA prior to receiving that information. And it was done from the standpoint of protecting the privacy of the seller. So the advisory board had an off-cycle meeting to consider that issue. And they had representatives from a couple of different MLSs in California speak to it for the advisory board's consideration. In the end, the advisory board made a determination that it was important to create policies so there was clear direction related to the matter. However, they did not believe that the issues of privacy would change or eliminate the ability of a listing broker to file the address with the participant or with the MLS so that other participants could view it in servicing their clients and customers. That there were other abilities to protect the distribution of that information, both in IDX and VOW. There's an opt-out of including an address, but that for the purposes of the participants of the service and their ability to efficiently service their clients and customers, that a policy should be adopted indicating that the listing address had to be filed with the service and that the distribution and display of that information to other MLS participants and subscribers should be immediate. And you see the recommendation in front of you.
Thank you, Rodney. And Rodney, you touched on a very important aspect of this, right? There are other provisions within policy that are, give some or provide for different handling for scenarios where you might be dealing on the listing side with a listing where there's different layers of privacy or safety that are required. If there's a scenario where there's an overarching privacy or safety concern and seller doesn't want that listing shared in the MLS, you can create an office exclusive. But it's not an all or nothing, right? There's policy provisions that allow, and you touched on it, allow someone to submit a listing at seller's request or direction, submit a listing and withhold distribution from the internet or display of address from the internet. This policy recommendation wouldn't alter any of those policies, right? Those continue to remain in effect. And if this policy is adopted, those don't go away, correct?
That is correct, Rene. That there is an exemption provision, often referred to as the office exclusive option, that is still available to participants who have clients who are concerned about their privacy and do not want to share information through the multiple listing service.
Great, thank you. Greg or Chris, anything to add on this particular policy recommendation on the discussion that occurred?
It was a very spirited debate. We had a lot of good information brought by the two MLSs, their concerns. We had a couple hours of debate just on this, or discussion on this particular question. And really, I think the group came down to a couple of things. One is the MLS makes the marketplace, and an address is kind of basic to that marketplace. Secondly, you have consistency across MLSs. And third, we didn't want to create a backdoor way of avoiding the clear cooperation policy, which has been so successful and is so important to the real estate industry.
And I'll just add, Rene, that in my mind, by not including an address through the MLS, if we're concerned with opportunities being missed by consumers, and CCP was an answer to that, it's pretty difficult even via a map search to find a property if you don't have an address.
Yep, definitely. Thank you for that, Chris. Well, with that, we've run through the full hour here. So lots to consider at the next MLS committee meeting next month. For those of you that joined us today, thank you so much. A lot of great discussion in the chat and a lot of great questions in the Q&A. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to post in the hub. Ashley provided the link within the chat. We'd love to continue the discussion there in the hub. Look forward to seeing you all attend the MLS Forum, which is on November 9th. And then the MLS Committee meeting is on November 11th. We also have the MLS AE session on Wednesday, November 4th. You can find all the information by going to conference.realtor. If you've registered for conference, when you log in, you can pull up the agenda and you'll have all the information on how to join those various sessions through that platform. To our panelists, Greg, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And Charlie and Rodney, thank you as well.